Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Monday Q&A, so let's get these knocked out. I'm going to try to do these quickly and get this done. I have multiple social engagements today. Sorry, my weekend's been really busy, but I think I've got time to pull these off today for Sunday, and I can have them up before tomorrow. So let's get to these questions. Got some slightly different questions this week, so let's knock it out. First question. What is your view on the recent article in the UK news which is stating that physical exercise does not contribute to fat loss whatsoever? The article stated while physical activity is useful in reducing the risk of developing heart disease, dementia, and other conditions, it does not promote weight loss. You know, they are right that exercise and training do stop a lot of medical conditions and reduce your chances of developing them, but they're simply not right on that. I understand what they mean that, oh, you're only burning a few hundred calories a day exercising, but in the long term, that does add up. There's also the factor that training, particularly weight training, will over time put muscle on you, speed up your metabolism a little bit, change your nutrient partitioning, and it's just silly to assume that, and it's because it's not permanent, because when you quit training for quite a bit of time, you lose all the benefits to that. But if you maintain your training indefinitely, you will keep the weight off that you lost. And that's no different than saying dieting or reducing calories or changing your diet doesn't work because if you end the diet, you regain it. No, it's part of an overall effective lifestyle. It does affect your TDEE to do weight training and cardio together, and it is a very viable tool for weight loss. It's absurd and extremely irresponsible of them to say that. That's your winning combination for weight loss for anybody is change in diet and dietary habits, weight training, cardio. Those three things in combination are your winning combination for everybody, and it is very irresponsible for a news publication to say otherwise. All right, next question. Mayweather versus Pacquiao. Who are you going for this May 2nd? I don't follow boxing that closely, to be honest. I'm not a big boxing fan, but I do keep up with it just a little bit. All right, guys, I'm not saying Pacquiao is not an amazing boxer and that he isn't a champion, because he is. These are two of the best boxers out there, period, hands down, the best. However, we don't even need to look at just this specific situation. Let's look at sports in general. It is very difficult to defeat in any sport a reigning champion for a number of reasons. First of all, they have the psychological edge on you. No matter how hungry you are and how driven of a competitor you are, when you're trying to unseat a reigning champion, they have a small psychological advantage on you, and if they use that to their advantage, they can beat you down before the competition or fight even starts. You've got that factor right there. And a reigning champion like that who wants to go out and retire as a reigning champion, they know how to do it. They know what they're doing. They know they got the psychological edge, and they're going to give it 100% because they want to leave that legacy. Whereas in the guy who's trying to come up still may not always be as driven, even though they think they are. They aren't as worried about their legacy in a lot of ways because they know they can still be the next champion when they retire. So just psychologically, they tend to have an edge. Then there's the judging and referee factor. Subconsciously in the minds of officials and referees and other people, if anything is a really close call, they're going to tend to not unseat a reigning champion unless it is a very clear victory. You do not edge out a reigning champion when it comes to judging and refereeing. You have to beat them flat out. So psychologically and from a judging perspective, Mayweather has the advantage there. And in all honesty, I think the odds are in his favor. He's probably going to win it. And if he does, congrats to him, man. To go out of your sport as the best in the world, as a reigning champion, to retire is the best that any athlete can ever hope for. That's the best you can do. And he's probably going to do it. All right, next question. I have an ACL partial tear and a torn lateral meniscus. That sucks. My surgeon recommends only doing half squats, as I've heard many other surgeons recommend the same thing. However, there's a lot of talk in the fitness community about whether half squats are actually worse for your knees in 90 degrees because the tension is shifted towards the glutes, hams, towards the bottom of the movement. Any thoughts or experience in this subject? Okay, generally when we're talking about people with healthy knees doing half squats, the problem is that people tend to overload and their knees shift forward, stopping the weight on the way down. And it puts more stress on the knee joint that you don't want, and you're generally using a weight that's heavier than you can move the joint through a full range of motion. So it does tend to put stress on there, but if you're sticking with a light enough weight and you're not hitting weights that are so heavy that you wouldn't be able to go to the bottom, and you aren't having to just brace yourself and grind to that stop, it isn't as bad. Now, when you're dealing with a damaged knee, however, you still have to follow those same rules, but there's what I would recommend instead is do box squats. Box squats are not something I prefer for a lot of people. For most people, I don't recommend them. But if you are someone who has knee issues, you've got damaged knees for whatever reason like that, that requires surgery, box squats done correctly where you sit all the way back and your knee stays well above your ankle the entire range of motion and you sit back on the box. Box squats can actually be amazing for people with knee damage who do not have healthy knees. So that might be what I would recommend to you. All right, next question. Intermediate powerlifting program to run whilst cutting. Would something like mad cows be too demanding for someone in a calorie deficit? No, anything that makes you big and strong when you're bulking will help you maintain strength and size when you are cutting. However, the difference is you're not going to have the recovery ability, the food, the nutrients, things like that you would have while eating a calorie surplus. So while you could run the program, you might want to adjust the progression. You may need to scale that progression back, or you may even need to focus on just maintaining your strength without any progression for the duration of the cut, particularly as an intermediate. You're going to struggle to gain strength on a cut as an intermediate unless it is a very, very, very slow cut. So if you're losing any sort of reasonable weight, just try to maintain your strength on it while using the base template and drop the progression itself out at. But you're not going to be able to run mad cows in its normal progression if you're a true intermediate while in a calorie deficit. The progression is just going to be too much for you to adapt to. So that's how I would handle something like that. You'll need to just modify the program slightly, but it is certainly viable if you modify the progression. Actually, it would be really good. All right, next question. Why does the food industry ruin food when they process them, such as grains, taking away their natural nutrients only to attempt to add back nutrition to it? Fortified foods does not make sense to me in an economic sense. No, it really does, because the processing of doing this is actually very, very cheap, and it produces products that are easier for people to cook and work with. It is actually more expensive on the production side to try to make all these whole grains into viable foods. They're less tasty. They're harder to cook. They're harder to put into your breads, pastas, things like that. So it's actually, in the total processing, it's cheaper in the long run for them to do it that way. And fortifying is very, very cheap. It costs pennies, less than pennies really per serving to refortify these foods. So that's why they do it. And it's because most people are also not going to want to deal with the processing end of all these whole grains. And there is the issue of things like too much fiber for some people who aren't used to it. I'm not saying from a health perspective it's smart, because from a health perspective it really isn't ideal. It isn't a good idea. From an economic perspective and people's time who don't want to deal with the extra cost of the whole foods sometimes, so particularly for the breads and pastas who are on really tight budgets, big families, people who don't want to deal with extra cooking times of whole foods, because be realistic here, true brown rice takes a lot longer to cook than white rice. It doesn't taste as good. So there's a lot of factors there involved as to why they do it. However, obviously from a health perspective, most of us who are concerned with fitness and health need to stick with mostly minimally processed stuff. So from that end, you're right. But from an economic perspective, no, what they do does make sense, and it is very viable when you understand the costs involved on the large scale of doing it that way. All right, next question. Who is John Otis Hollywood? Never heard of him till Marc Lobner and Chris Jones mentioned him. Then you and luimarco later mentioned him. It's like he came out of nowhere with virtually no portfolio other than one ghetto put together video on his YouTube channel. What's his background? What's his story? I actually know John Hollywood. He's a good guy. We do chat in private. We've chatted in private extensively in the past over the last couple of years sometimes. I haven't talked to him much lately. John, actually the reason you haven't heard of him a lot is because John's primary job is not a coach. He is a very good prep coach. His people get amazing results. I've had personal real life friends of mine who I know in person, not on the internet, who have hired him and have been very, very impressed with what he does. But John is actually a clinical psychologist by trade. However, when you're talking about contest prep, psychology and getting in the minds and getting people on diets that they can follow and a regimen that they can follow psychologically is more important than the nutrition side, because you can get anybody lean enough if you can keep them in a calorie deficit long enough. That's all psychology. And since he is a clinical psychologist, he is very good at doing that and staying on top of his people. He is very controlling with his clients, but he does that because he knows how to get them the results. He is anal retentive about stuff, but again, that's because he gets inside their heads, knows how to work with people, knows how to deal with people who have different sort of problems with their relationships with food and things, and that's why he's a good prep coach. And yeah, he is good at what he does, and I do recommend him personally. All right, next question. Can getting extra sleep over 8 hours a night affect your ability to cut body fat as you expend less energy during sleep versus being awake? Will that lower your TDEE? Subject to a lot of debate. There's a lot to look at here. What I would say as far as that goes, no, it's not going to lower your TDEE, because the things to keep in mind is that if you get enough sleep to where you're fully recovered and fully energized, you're going to be more active and less sluggish during your awake time. So if you're more active, you're burning through more calories during the day because you're more rested, that's actually better off. Even though technically you're burning less asleep than you are sluggish, it's still going to be better in the long run. And then there is the factor to consider that if you're sleeping less, you might actually, I'm sorry, not sleeping less, but sleeping more, you might actually snack less, because more time spent asleep also means less time awake, less time that you might be thinking about food, and you have less time that you're not doing other stuff. So it may actually, in some cases, depending on the person, on occasion, help control intake as well. So no, it's not a problem there. All right, next question. Hey Jason, when we see videos of very lean people doing these 5K, 10K, and even 20K calorie challenges and still being lean after finishing them, you mean like my bro Devin Palumbo? Hell yeah. What happens to all the excess energy? It doesn't get stored as fat, and in some used for tissue repair, glycogen replenishment, bodily functions. Where does it go? Well, first of all, we know that short-term overfeeding from plenty of studies, particularly on active people, doesn't cause fat gain. And there's a very, very finite limit to how much fat you can gain in a single 24-hour period. So what happens with these people, most of it gets burned off as thermic energy. Like if you overfeed and you've been slightly depleted because you're dieting, let's say they really diet hard 3 or 4 days before they do one of these massive food challenges. First of all, the body can only absorb about 15,000 calories in a single 24-hour period. You tend to excrete the rest out. And the slowest digesting thing is body fat. It's the slowest absorbed, so not body fat, but dietary fat. You tend to excrete everything beyond the 15,000 calories out. Well, the biggest chunk of what you excrete out at that point, if you're going to like 20,000, is going to tend to be fat. The other thing is that in short-term overfeeding, the only thing you can store as fat is dietary fat. Surplus carbs from a single day of overfeeding, no matter how many you eat, tend to be expended as body heat. You sweat a lot, you burn through them as heat, energy, fidgeting. You will burn through thousands and thousands of calories of carbs unless you're very insulin resistant. So that just gets burned off as body heat, and if you do it for several days, then you'll start storing it. But from a single day, no way. So you're only going to be able to store the fat, and you're excreting a lot of that fat out. You might end up happening, someone who's very lean, who's been dieting, might only gain half a pound from a massive, gigantic overfeed, half a pound of fat, which isn't going to be noticeable on them, and then they're going to lose that half a pound of fat over their dieting over the next few days. So the net result is that they gorge themselves and eat an insane amount of food and end right back up where they were a week later. So that's why that happens. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.